Making your own DIY, efoil, or jetboard is a dream for many aspiring developers. Today, we continue our series of DIY interviews. Meet Jake Barnhill from Australia, who is one of the most inspiring guys who developed his own efoil and jetboard.
Hi Jake, and welcome to our show. Thank you for doing this. The efoil and jetboard do-it-yourself community will really appreciate all your advice, considering you made so many different projects in this industry. So before we start, tell me how you got into this do-it-yourself jetboarding and efoiling.
Well, I've always sort of been interested in I've always enjoyed building things, and I've been into motorbikes from a young age, and I've always enjoyed sort of having remote control helicopters and planes and stuff as a kid. Then when I was in year 8, there was our physics teacher at school had a workshop where you'd build your own quadcopters, that's like a drone basically. And from that, me and a few mates did that, and we sort of got hooked on building our own drones, and we were able to sort of work on them, and that taught us a lot about the electronics, batteries and motors, because the systems in drones, you've got like a battery and an ESC and a motor, and it's all really the same principles that applies to efoils and jetboards and electric skateboards and stuff like that. So was into the drones and stuff for a few years, and got into building electric skateboards, and the efoil was sort of the next challenge. So that's sort of how I got into it. And I've actually it was about 2018 I got into it. That was when I built my first efoil, and it sort of just went on from there. And I've really been enjoying working on it and building and improving, so yeah.
That's really cool. So if anybody wants to get into the do-it-yourself way, what kind of skills do they need to possess before they even get started in this?
Well, it's definitely handy to have a few skills. I know a lot of people who are getting into efoils have built their own electric skateboards or their own FPV racing drones. So it's definitely handy to sort of have the skills with those smaller, easy to build machines before you take on getting into efoils, because it sort of, with an electric skateboard, it doesn't use as much power. So all your wires are thinner. The solder joints don't need to be as good, because there's not as much power going through it. Then you'll find when you get into efoils, things that go on water tend to use a lot more power. And you can, if you have a same dodgy electrical connection that you would have had on an electric skateboard, in an efoil, that connection will end up frying, and it's a lot easier to sort of blow things up basically with efoils and stuff. So having a bit of experience with electric skateboards and stuff like that does help. But if you're good at working on cars or motorbikes or that sort of stuff, then it'll be no problem if you just take your time and go straight into building an efoil or something like that. So,
all right. And if we compare the efoil and jetboard, which one you think it's easier to make and why?
I think that an efoil is easier to make, mainly because all the parts in it are smaller. It tends to be a bit cheaper as well. With an efoil, you've got a smaller motor, and efoils tend to use up to around 4 kilowatts of power, so you can use thinner wires and a smaller battery than a jetboard. And another thing with efoils is, I've built both, and I don't know whether you've seen my jetboard video, but my jetboard pretty much runs on 2 efoil batteries, but I'm using a lot thicker wires, so everything's harder to make. And I also designed the jet, so that took a lot more time and more time in designing and also to manufacture it. But the good thing about efoils is there's good cheap motors you can buy that work, that you can pretty much 3D print up a mount and get it to bolt straight onto your hydrofoil. Then you can, if you want to, you can just buy an old surfboard or a windsurfer, bolt the foil to that. And so some people actually, what I did on my first efoil, for my first one, I had an old surfboard and just had a container at the front with my batteries in that, and that was an easy way to do it. And it was really cheap as well, because I was just using Hobby King batteries. and 2 hobby king outrunner motors. So an efoil is definitely easier. The jetboard it's got to be really tuned well to work. But an efoil, you can sort of get away with an inefficient propeller and it'll still work pretty well. So yeah, I'd say an efoil is a bit easier.
Okay, let's go through the process of creating efoil. I saw your process video, but let's explain for people who get started step by step how you did it. Like, what was the first step and where you got the components.
Well, with my first efoil, I sort of didn't have many project goals with it. I sort of just wanted it to work. So with that one, I got 2 cheap motors off Hobby King, $60 each, and I bought myself a 3D printer. And the 3D printer I use is a Creality CR10, and I think a lot of people have had success with that brand. So I 3D printed up some mounts for those motors and put them on a $500 foil off AliExpress, bolted that to an old surfboard, and then got an ABS container and put that at the front of the surfboard with the batteries and electronics in it. And after a bit of tuning, it ended up working pretty well. But yeah, after that, I sort of wanted to make it a bit better. I wanted to be able to go further. You know, the first efoil only went for a minute before it overheated and I had to stop and let it cool down. So I wanted to sort of be actually, you know, could go out and ride for an hour and have fun. You wouldn't have to worry about things breaking. So from there, the sort of process you take to building an efoil, I guess you'd first want to work out what you want to get out of it. So if you want to just have something sort of more, if you sort of just want something for a bit of fun, like you only want half an hour ride time or something, you can make something really cheap just using like a Hobby King. You can use, if you wanted to make one for under $1,000 that, you know, works for a 10-15 minute ride, you could, like I did for my first one. But I think a lot of people would probably rather an efoil that sort of compares more to the commercial ones, which is sort of where I got to with mine, with my most recent efoil. And so with that one, I decided on the wing that I'd want, and I knew that I'd want to ride for an hour and a half or something like that. So I built a 2 kilowatt-hour battery, which is about 10 kilos. And a lot of the people on the forum sort of helped a lot with getting it built. But yeah, so you sort of decide on the battery size you want first, which is what I did. I worked out how big the battery was going to be, and I worked out what electronics I was going to use, and I sort of positioned that. I worked out, I saw on the commercial foils how they have their weight directly above in the board, and it's a lot better having your weight in the board, because with my first one, with the weight at the front of the surfboard, when you're turning, having all the weight at the nose, really, it makes it handle really weirdly. Like when you're turning, it can't turn as well. So yeah, it's better to have the weight positioned inside the board. And yeah, so you sort of plan the size of the battery you want, the electronics, then I built the board around that. And the board that I built, I bought, it's made out of 4 sheets of foam. It's a sort of a generic size you can get from any hardware store. And with each bit of foam, I cut out a size for where the battery and the electronics would sit inside it. And because they're thin pieces of foam, you can cut the section out of each piece and then glue them together. And so the 3 bits of foam, when glued together, made the nice thick board with the enclosure in it. And then the 4th piece, I just cut in thirds and added to the front. So yeah, that was making the board's the hardest part. So once I got that, then I decided on the foil that I'd use. And in my case, I was originally using an 8100 outrunner motor, which is, I don't know whether you've seen the motors on drones, but the outside of the motor turns and the propeller's directly mounted to that. But yeah, so I used 2 outrunner motors, similar size to the ones used in electric skateboards, and had one mounted on the front and one mounted, they were in line. And I'll be able to show you a photo of this later on that you can overlay on the footage. But yeah, those outrunners. Yeah, so that was my first one. Yeah, and with those motors, they weren't very efficient. and I couldn't go that far on a charge, and it was complex because I had to have double the electronics because there were 2 motors. So after that, I designed my own motor, because it turned out that there's efoil motors that are direct drive that don't have a gearbox, and then there's ones that have a gear, which is using a higher revving motor that the speed is reduced by the gearbox for the propeller. So I designed a motor with a gearbox, similar to what other people have been doing on the forum, but I designed it so everything could be made in aluminium, which is a lot easier than using 3D printed parts that can leak water over time and stuff like that. And that motor let me, it gave it really good performance. One of my goals with it was to be able to keep up with a water skier, which is usually about a bit over 30 k's an hour. And I wanted to be able to keep up with a water skier for the whole charge. And it was a lot really efficient compared to that first motor I had with the 2 outrunners on the foil. So then I designed the motor. I used a slingshot foil, so I bolted that to the board and sorted out the lid with the board. I made this latches on the lid. On other boards you can use screws, but that's sort of a bit more complex. So once you sort of do that, that's sort of the rough process to making an efoil.
All right. So from the followers' questions, I saw the main challenge is always the battery and making it waterproof. How you were solving these issues?
You're not wrong. So there's sort of 2 challenges. One's keeping the battery waterproof, and the other is sort of having the enclosure in the board waterproof as well. So a good way to go about designing it is to aim to have the enclosure in the board as waterproof as you can. You'll find that there's always going to be a little bit that leaks in, just because it's difficult to seal such a big lid perfectly unless you go to a lot of effort. It is possible, but usually there's going to be a bit that leaks in. So that's sort of your first line of defense. And then your second line of defense is having the battery inside the board waterproof as well, and the electronics as well. They're both waterproof inside the board. So if water does end up getting into the compartment, it won't really matter, because the stuff inside it's waterproof as well. And I do see with the jetboards, they actually tend to have the battery is waterproof itself, and it just goes into the board. Like, that's another way with efoils, that's not really how it's done. I did see that the Wadu efoil has a battery that just goes straight into the board. And that actually is a really simple way of doing it. But for most of the DIYers, we sort of have a compartment that the battery goes inside. So it's best to try and have 2 lines of defense, which is the compartment and then the battery being waterproof in a waterproof enclosure. And with making the battery waterproof, with my efoil batteries, I found that the battery I built, it fit perfectly inside a waterproof container that you can just buy. So that's really handy if you can find a container to do that, which is definitely easy. And then another option, which for the batteries I built for my jetboard, I 3D printed the container in 4 sections, and then glued those 3D printed parts together, and then put fiberglass around, and then fiberglass over the 3D prints. And that way you can have it was a sort of a nicer shape than the container, took up less space. And then I just had a flat aluminium panel on the top. So yeah, there's a few ways you can go about it, but.
Okay, and what about the overheating issues you mentioned before? You were stopping after 1 minute, and now you went to 1 hour and half.
Yeah, well, that was the reason it was overheating was it wasn't the motors weren't overheating, because they're in the water, they're fine. It was actually the ESCs, which were with that first board. It was I had Hobby King batteries, which are just they're sort of built for drones and RC planes. I had a few of them connected together inside the box, and then next to those were 2 electric Vesk ESCs, but they were the first one. They're sort of ones that were sized for electric skateboards, so they weren't really built to handle the 40 amps continuous current that an efoil requires. Whereas an electric skateboard's really only using 5 to 10 amps continuously. So those ESCs in an efoil just couldn't handle the power. So after to increase the riding time, I basically just, this is still on the same board with the 2 motors on it. I got some bigger Hobby King ESCs that are built for RC planes again, but sort of more high performance RC planes. I put in some of those ESCs and did some heat sinking with them, and I could increase the riding time to about 15 minutes. And they still ran pretty hot, but it worked. And that's set up with those 2 motors, the 2 ESCs and the Hobby King batteries. It was very cheap. It's probably the cheapest way that you could build an efoil that sort of works. But then after that, I sort of aimed for more efficiency. Those 2 motors used about 2.8 kilowatts just to cruise, which is a lot for an efoil. Like the average efoil would only use about 1.5 kilowatts to cruise. So yeah, after that, going to the single motor with a gearbox, I then also bought a better ESC again, which is the Vesk 75300, and it's a really good system.
So speaking of the budget, considering you were first making a cheaper solution and then more expensive one, so if anybody has a limited budget, what's the minimum amount we need to get started with efoil?
To start with an efoil, if you want to, you can get a pretty decent efoil for about $1,200, I'd say. That's including like the charger and that's mainly using hobby parts. So to build an efoil for that price, the best way to do it would be using an 8100 size outrunner motor, and you can get there's a propeller that a lot of people who build efoils use. It's built for 2 horsepower outboards, and you use that propeller with that 8100 size outrunner, and yeah, the motor's about $250 from memory. The propeller's $30. You can use the Flyer ESCs, which are a couple of hundred. They're probably $300. Then if you pair it with if you do well with getting a cheap foil and board and sort of just Hobby King batteries, that'll sort of get you flying for about just over $1,000, and it'll work pretty well. That 8100 size outrunner, it's a common motor that people use, and I've actually used it as well. And for an outrunner underwater, it does tend to be less efficient to have the outside of the motor turning as well as the propeller, because the motor turning in the water generates more friction. So with that 8100, you can sort of cruise under 2000 watts, which is pretty good. And I found for me that I could get over 30 k's an hour. But if I did go over 30 k's an hour, it'd be using sort of 4000 watts. And you'd sort of drain your battery in about 30 to 35 minutes. So it was really after that motor that I wanted to be able to keep up with a water skier for a long time, because our family water skis, and I'd taken the efoil out a bit with them, and I'd find that if I was keeping up with my brother who was on the ski, I'd be really taking a big hit in my battery life, and I'd cut my ride short. So then going to the geared motor, I could maintain keeping up with the skier for over about an hour, and then, so that was sort of how it progressed.
So I saw you've been doing really aggressive riding on your efoil, and you even hit the sandbank and crashed a lot. So yeah. What were the weak parts, and what were the main challenges of this efoil design in your opinion?
Yeah, with that test where I hit the sandbank at 50 k's an hour, I do a lot of riding in the river, and there tends to be a lot of sticks and stuff you can hit that are under the water that you can't see. So yeah, with that, I actually did a bit of a test with the motor I designed, and I wanted to sort of see how much speed I could get out of it. So I built a battery that was, so the normal battery that I was using was 50 volts. It was 44 volts, sorry. And the battery that I put in it was another, what was it? It's about 57 volts. So it's a bit over 10 volts more. and it was 16S. They call it 16S, so it's 16 batteries in series instead of 12 batteries in series. So yeah, that gave the motor more RPM, and I ended up getting over 50 k's an hour on it. But yeah, the biggest challenge with that was like everything sort of worked pretty well. I had to do a lot of tuning I found that I had to do a lot of tuning to the vest to get it to run the motor without losing sync with the motor at those higher power levels and speeds. But no, apart from that, it was all pretty smooth because I'd sort of worked out the challenges with the board and stuff with my designs before. But yeah, the big challenge with the board that I found is making the foil mount where the foil bolts onto the board strong. So I did build a board. One board I built was it was a failure. Like I just ended up not just building a new one afterwards because it wasn't strong enough around the foil mount. After a few rides, it started cracking, and it was mainly just because I didn't have enough reinforcement. So with the boards now, I use 2 pieces of aluminium that are about 1 metre long, and the foil bolts through those 2 pieces of aluminium and they run along the board for 1 metre. So they distribute the load over a big area.
Like we do, yeah.
And I think that video where I hit the sandbank proved how strong the foil mount was, because the board was fine, and the 2 bolts that bolt the mast to the mast plate that bolts to the board actually snapped off, which is probably a good thing because it saved damage to the board and to the mast plate and the foil mast as well. So definitely the foil mount needs to be strong. So if you want to do jumps and stuff and ride in the ocean where you sort of can't have anything breaking on you and you're being stranded out in the water.
Okay, I don't know if you tried any commercial efoils, and at least you probably saw them. So what's your opinion comparing your efoil build to their products?
I did have a chance to try the Fliteboard at one of the flight schools up in Manly, and definitely the commercial boards, they're very nice. The Fliteboard, I really do like it. I found though that with the Fliteboard, their remote, with the DIY boards, we use the remote that most people are using is a trigger. And so you have full control over the motor and it's very responsive with the trigger. But with the Fliteboard, they've got a different system where the trigger has a small amount of control over the motor speed, and you can increase and decrease the amount of power. I think you've ridden it. It's got like they call it the virtual gears. And because I've never ridden that before, I actually found it really hard to get used to. Like I think that the trigger is a better system, but the virtual gears are probably better for beginners. What do you think about the Fliteboard? Have you ridden both, the trigger or the virtual gears?
Yeah, I've been riding Fliteboard for a while. Lift, I tried a few times. I think it limits the speed a lot, so it's much easier for beginners, like you said. In your case, you get too much speed too fast. If you're a complete beginner, you just probably launch to space and crash right away. You have to be really slow on the low gears, like 8, 6, 7. Yeah. But I think Fliteboard is, especially in flight schools, it's a great way for people who never tried efoil before. It's really easy to start.
Yeah, no, definitely, you're right. It is a lot easier for beginners. I think it'd be good though if they had a trigger, so once you get better, you'd have the full control of the motor. But then you do see some of their riders who are doing some pretty serious riding, and they're doing it with their remote. So it's probably just a matter of putting some time into it and getting used to it. It's probably, yeah.
Exactly. But speaking of the remote, what remote you're using?
I'm using the Maytech remote, and it's probably the most common remote for the DIY efoilers
and no issues with waterproofing.
There are some. What was that? Sorry.
No problems with water getting into the remote.
I haven't had any problems with it, but one of my Maytech remotes did. I've used about 3 of them, because one of them I did have a problem with a bit of water. The screen stopped working, but the remote was still working. Just couldn't see anything on the screen. But I think it's pretty good. I haven't had any issues with it. there's been some people on the forum who have had issues with water getting in, but it's probably a very small percentage, and I think it is a good remote. And it's got a very nice trigger. It has a long, it's got a good amount of play in it, so you can have a very fine control of the motor. It's not too touchy. Like I've tried using, with my before I got the Maytech remote, I tried using an electric surfboard, an electric skateboard remote, sorry, in a rubber glove. And I found that its throttle was really touchy and it was hard to stay balanced on the foil with it. So the Maytech remote is pretty good.
All right. So finally, let's switch to the jetboard that you made. I just saw also the videos. It's really fast. You reached like 66 kilometers per hour, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. It's huge, by the way, but also you did also 360 rotations. It's really cool. So tell me, what was the budget again to build the jetboard?
The jetboard was definitely a bit more expensive than the efoils, like because there's two batteries and more expensive electronics. It sort of more came into, we're talking US dollars here, it was about $5,500 US dollars all up.
And the efoil you said, what amount efoil you said in US dollars?
My efoil I built for about $3,500 US dollars. The one that the first one was a lot less obviously, but the one I have now, which is comparable performance to one you buy, about $3,500 US dollars.
So jetboard is more expensive just because of the battery?
Battery, mainly the battery. I was fortunate to have some of the aluminium parts. Some of the parts are laser cut in it, and I have a friend who could do that, so that saved a bit of costs. But yeah, the jetboard would probably, when I think about it, might have been a bit more than $5,500. It's probably closer. It's probably $6,000 or $6,500 US dollars.
All right. And what jet pump and the speed controller are you using in the jetboard?
In the jetboard, I was using the Vesk 75-300 at the start, and I was actually very impressed with how it works because my jetboard draws about 18 kilowatts of power. Well, it was when I had the Vesk installed, I had a lower pitched impeller, so it drew about 16 kilowatts with the Vesk. And even though the Vesk would overheat if you were riding it, if you were drawing a lot of power for over a minute or two, and it'd start dialing back the power, but the power would be back after it cooled down again after a bit of riding slower. But I was sort of only using the Vesk because I could get. The great thing about it is all the live data that it can show you. So when I was using the Vesk, I learned a lot about how the jet absorbs power, how many RPM the motor's doing for what speed and what power level and that sort of stuff. So I was using the Vesk. It did pretty well really. So after the Vesk, I ended up getting a higher pitched impeller, and that loaded the motor up to about a bit over 18 kilowatts on acceleration. And the ESC I used then was the Flyer. It was an 800 amp Flyer ESC. So it sorted out my problems till a few weeks ago where a bit of water leaked in on it and it caught on fire. And I'll be able to show the video of that. But it was a good ESC till water leaked in, so that was my own fault, user error. But yeah, the jetboard, I found the jetboards had been a very interesting challenge compared to building the efoils. And the cool thing about water jets compared to propellers is with a water jet, no matter what speed the board's going, the motor can reach its full RPM. So that means when you're not moving and you plant the throttle, the motor instantly reaches full speed, and therefore it's putting out full power at no speed, and that's why you get such good acceleration out of it. Whereas with like propeller, like efoils or boats, or whatever, with a propeller, the motor can't reach full speed when you're not moving. It needs to gradually increase speed of the propeller as the vessel speeds up, because the propeller can only have so much sort of slip on the water. So that's sort of why you see jet skis and the jet craft have such good acceleration. It's because the motor can reach its full power straight away.
All right.
And also with my jetboard, I should talk about the steering system that I added. So that where you can see the 360s, that made it was really fun. I was controlling it from the side, sort of like an RC boat. So I had a few people on it, but they're not actually controlling where it goes. It's me on the side with the remote control boat remote. But it makes it really fun, having the steering, being able to do 360s, and it turns really sharp. So.
And how are you steering to make it go 360? No fins?
It's got fins. No, oh yeah, it's the same way that a jet ski turns. So on your jetboard, you've got the nozzle where the water comes out. There's basically a second nozzle that attaches to the original nozzle, and it pivots, and that angles the thrust, and it vectors the thrust to give you steering force. So it's a lot better than having a rudder, because then nothing can grab when you're doing 360s and stuff, and sort of you can get sideways without anything grabbing the water.
That's interesting. I've never seen this solution in any of commercial jetboards for some reason. Why do you think they don't do this?
I'm not sure. Like, I guess with the Jetsurf, it's like some of the jetboards turn really well, but I do see that some boards, they really struggle to turn sharp, some of the commercial boards, and it probably would benefit a lot from having a pivoting, like a thrust vectoring nozzle on the back to make it turn sharper. But no, I'm not sure why they do it, and some of them look like they have quite a slow turning circle that could probably be improved by having a thrust vectoring nozzle. So yeah, but then some of the jetboards, they turn so sharp anyway that they probably don't need it.
All right. And considering fun-wise, what do you find more exciting to ride yourself, efoil or jetboard? What do you use more often?
At the moment, I think I'm enjoying the jetboard more at the moment, especially because riding in the river, you have very low risk of hitting snags like I do on the efoil. So yeah, at the moment, I've been enjoying the jetboard a lot more. And that's yeah. How are we doing for time, Mike?
So, and what's next for you? What is your end goal? Do you plan to make like commercial board one day, or you just keep progressing in what you do?
I want to keep progressing just with what I do at the moment. This year I've started university studies to do engineering, so I'm sort of not sure what I'll I do want to start a company to do with this sort of stuff, but yeah, I definitely think it's worth waiting to have something that's really, really worth bringing out before starting in this area. So yeah, we'll see what happens, I guess.
So what's your final advice for people who want to get into do-it-yourself jetboarding and efoiling? Should they do it, or it's too difficult? What's your final words?
I think take it on, but probably the best advice to people who are sort of starting out is just make sure you take your time and do it right, especially with the batteries. I've seen a few cases where people have sort of rushed and they've done dodgy spot welds or made dodgy connections to the battery management system, and there's so you've just got you can't stuff up on that, or you can end up burning a house down or burning a car down, so it's just, you've got to take your time, and it's definitely something very achievable for most people to be able to build an efoil or a jetboard. So with a bit of time to invest in it to get it right. So yeah.
All right, thank you, Jake. So finally, if people want to follow your journey, tell us more. You have a YouTube channel now. Where can they follow you?
Yeah, I've got a YouTube channel. That's really where I post all my stuff, my progress with jetboards and efoils and stuff, which is just Jake Barnhill. And yeah, that's the main place I post on, where you can sort of keep up to date. And
the foil.zone forum as well, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, if you want to get into building an efoil, foil.zone, the forum is the best resource that you can spend some hours reading there, and that's definitely the best way of getting knowledge about where to start with what parts to use and that sort of stuff. It's a great forum. There's a lot of great information on there. You can learn a lot.
All right, thank you again, Jake. So keep doing what you do.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Yeah. It's been good talking to you.
It was a pleasure. You're very inspiring for the community. So keep doing good job. And cheers.
Keep up good work as well.
Cheers.